Lossien, and today we're going to turn all of this into this. To make Imogen's vest, we're first going to start by making the pattern. Then we cut that out and sew it together to create the mock-up. Then we try that on, see if any adjustments need to be made. After the adjustments, we'll cut it out of our good fabric and then start sewing the actual vest together. We're going to start from the top down, so we're marking where the neck point is going to be along the folded end, all the way down to where the bust point is. We're doing that as well on the selvage edge. On this edge, however, because this will be the front of the garment, we're going to measure in towards the center of the fabric a good 2 inches and do all our marks 2 inches from that edge, because we have the crossover of the buttons down below. The edge with the fold is going to end up being our back, so that the fold is the center back, and the other side is going to be the front. So after you've measured from the neck point down to the bust point, we're going to measure from the bust to the waist, and then from the waist to the bottom of the points are going to be. You can see here that I made a little mistake on my bust to waist measurements and then had to adjust that on the fabric. You can also go just a little longer than you think you want the finished vest to be, because we can always take it in when we do the mock-up and make sure that it's got enough fabric. Once we have all those measurements down, we're going to go back up to the neck point and measure out from the center front to the neck point, that distance, and then from the neck point to the shoulder point. After that's marked, we're going to go up at the neck point up 1/4 inch and down at the shoulder point 1/4 inch, so that our line is a slight diagonal. Now we're going to do this on the front and the back, going towards the center, because that's where our seams are going to be. Along the bust front, we're going to draw it out our center front bust measurement, or half of it, towards the inside of that bust measurement. Because this is where the vest actually crosses over, or just above, we're going to add half of the width of the button plus 1/2 inch towards that selvage edge. And along the back, we're going to do that measurement out of half the back bust measurement. Then we're going to draw a line for the waist. Now, if your waist is quite a bit different, smaller than your bust measurement, then you're only going to want to go in a maximum of about 3/4 inch to 1 inch total. We'll end up doing the darts for shaping while we're wearing it, so don't worry too much if this is going to make it too big. If you're a bit more straight up and down, that's totally fine, or if you have a larger waist, then feel free to go out just a little bit. We're going to connect that bust and waistline with a straight line. And then we're going to go up about 2 inches from the bust line towards the armhole, or between 1 and 2 inches, depending on how much you took in for a dress. And then we're just going to make a scoop line from the arm point down to the bottom of the armhole. Then you can see what I've just done very quickly is drawn a little scoop for the back neck from that neck point in the center down about 1.5 inches, because that's what I find most comfortable. On the front, we're giving a bit of a space for more hips because I am fairly curvy. I just measured myself around the hips 1 inch down from my waist and made sure that my waist measurement, that the hip measurement was at least that. I did the same on the back just to make sure that it wasn't going to pull too much at my hips because I want it to lay correctly. Then I gave it a very vague point shape and hoped that that was going to be right. Now on the front neck, I just measured down to about where I wanted it, which was in line with the armhole, and drew a V shape from that neck point at the top all the way down to where I wanted that point. Now, when I was doing this, I didn't add my seam allowance. This is where you would. And also 1 inch of seam allowance or hem allowance on the very bottom on those points so that you can do the hem properly. But the other thing to remember is, because I personally am using a stretch material, I wanted everything to be a little tight because in the official art, there's a bit of wrinkling to the shirt, to the vest, and that's what I specifically was going for when I was making mine. So if you're using a material that has no stretch or you don't like that look, I would give yourself about a 1/2 inch of extra fabric on every single horizontal measurement, just in general. So that's only a 1/4 inch on the front bust and a 1/4 inch on the back bust, and so on and so forth. The next step is the facing. So I picked a bit of material that I had extra that was on the fold, and I just retraced that neck on the back. Then I took the piece off so I knew exactly where that seam was and gave myself seam allowance down and then an extra seam allowance amount on top of that. So it was about 1 inch all the way around, and then cut it out. So when I laid it on top, it lined up exactly with that seam, but gave me some extra. Then I did the same for the armholes, just on the back again, where I traced out the whole armhole, making sure I noted where the shoulder seam and the side seam were. Then I gave it that 1/2 inch and then an additional 1/2 inch in that curve and cut it out. Now, this is fabric that's twice over, so it gave me 2 with only cutting 1, you know, like you normally do. And that meant that I had 2 back armholes. You don't actually need these pieces for the front because we're going to do it a little differently, but this gives you a nice clean finish. It's called a facing. I also needed 2 strips of fabric for the back to make the tie. So I picked a fabric that I knew was long enough to be at least a little over half of that back waist measurement, and I cut it out. Now I had a piece of hardware that I was going to use that you'll see in a bit that was about 3/4 inch on the inside, so I made sure that my fabric folded was 3/4 inch plus seam allowance so that I could make a little tube and flip it right side out. And I made sure I had 2 of those. The very last thing that we need to do for cutting this mock-up, and again, if you're doing a mock-up, we've talked about this before, you don't have to use the same material, but if you're going to have a stretch material for the finished product, you should use a stretch material for your fitting. I had tons of this fabric and I ended up not having to recut it, so it worked out well, but I'm a bit of a chaotic sewer. So that front piece that we did, I laid out and cut the whole thing a second time. Because we have buttons, we have the armhole, we have a lot going on here, I wanted it to make sure that there were no seams that we were going to see if anything shifted. So I just cut a whole second set, so we have 4 in total of the front piece. Sewing this mock-up is actually surprisingly easy. We're going to start with our back piece and open it up, and we're going to sew all good side to good side, so finish side to finish side. Then you're going to take your front and line up the shoulder seams. Make sure that the side seams also line up so that like the front with that V is towards the front. This is easy to mess up. I've done it myself. Then all you're going to do is with a nice long basting stitch, sew across that top shoulder seam. And we're going to repeat for the other side. And then what we're going to do is sew down the side seams, just from the top to the bottom, on one side and then the other side. These are really easy to line up because we've already lined them up when we did the shoulder seams. Then we're going to take one of those 2 back tie pieces, fold it in half, and sew it along that same side seam right at the waist, but fold it in half so it's smaller. And we're going to do the same on the other side. This just means that we can pin these in the back and make sure that it fits properly when we're trying everything on. And again, these should line up where that waist measurement is. The very first thing that we're going to do is put on the vest to try it on. Now, I leave all the seams on the outside so that we can adjust them if needed, and I just pinned all the way down the center front, double checking which side went on top. P.S. hers is actually technically a men's vest, and the left side goes on top of the right side, which is technically incorrect for women's clothing in a Western society, which is what I base it on. The next step that I did was actually pin those little flaps that I wanted where the hem was going to be and where they'd end up being, just so I could get like a visual idea of if it was sitting in the right place. Now I highly recommend making sure you have the dress on at this point so you can make sure it looks right for you. I also had the shorts underneath. And just taking a moment to do this really makes a difference overall because you know that you're happy where everything's sitting. Then I noticed that it was gaping at the armhole in the front. Now this is completely fine because I wanted to put a dart in here and we didn't put one into the pattern. So with my fingers, I squished the fabric together right in the armhole until it laid flat, going into nothing at the bust. So that's making a dart basically by hand. And this meant that I knew it would just lay nice and flat along the top edge. And that's really what I was worried about there, and just in the underarm area. We're gonna deal with the fact that it's still too baggy at the waist in a couple moments, but this was just getting that armhole to lay flat against me. Now, to me it felt way too baggy all the way around, so the next thing I ended up doing was taking in the side seams about an inch all the way down to the waist, and then letting it go back out to 0 at the hip. I really didn't want it too tight at the hip because if it gets tight, then those points are going to flip up as you're wandering around. Now you can definitely leave it as is, but I didn't want to put any darts into the back because trying to pin your own darts on your own back is so frustrating. And because I was working with a stretch material, I had a bit more give with it. So I pinned the one side and then I quickly pinned the other side just to get an idea of how it was going to sit. The last thing I needed to pin was the darts. You can see here that there's quite a bit of extra fabric, and I wanted the shaping of the chest, to be honest. So I pinned it directly at the underbust, making sure I was wearing the same bra that I was going to wear with the actual costume, and also at the waist. You can see me working with my hands to make sure it's equal side to side, or as equal as possible, and then pinning it straight down, making sure not to catch my dress underneath, which I accidentally did. That was the thing. Had to try and get out of it. But my main points of pinning are directly under the bust, and then the waist, and then a couple pins over the cup of the bra. This way I can make sure that it has the right shaping for the bra that I'm wearing, because some bras sit differently. And if you're more masculine or you don't want to have a shaped bust, this can be more of a straight line all the way down. I ended up with kind of a ridge from that armhole dart all the way down to the point at the very bottom, which I quite liked because this meant that it could be almost two separate pieces. You can see me double checking that I've not pinned what's underneath, and just really taking my time to get that shaping by pinching the fabric together and walking it with my fingers until it's actually sitting nicely on my body. And once I was happy with the darts, I just took a step back to make sure I was happy with how everything was laying. I ended up folding in the neckline, that seam allowance amount, same with the shoulder seam, just to make sure it sat where I wanted it to, because it was looking a little big just because of the seam allowance. And once I was happy with it, it was time to take out the pins on the center front that were standing in for buttons and go to the alterations area. Because all of my alterations were only taking in pattern pieces as opposed to letting them out, I was able to reuse all of the pieces I had already cut and didn't actually need to redo the entire thing. If you ended up having to add some fabric, then you would want to take this to a separate area, take it apart, make your adjustments, and then cut it out again, but we're going to skip over that part in this pattern example. So the first thing I did was rip the shoulder seams because there was no adjustments there. Because this was a nice large basting stitch, it was quite easy to literally just rip it. The next thing I did was make sure all my pins were in correctly and actually take off those back pieces that were the tie. This was just a super 2-second quick thing that meant that I could then focus on the side seam where we had taken it in. The next thing I did was lay the two side seams right next to each other. Now I want it to be equal on both sides, being taken in the same amount, so all that I did was along each area measured how much it was taken in on either side. So at the top I measured in on the one side and on the other from the original stitching line to where it was pinned. I added those two measurements from the two sides together and divided it by 2, which gave me the average that I knew I was going to take in both sides. Then, once I knew how much that was all the way down, for me it was one measurement, but it could change depending on your body shape. It could be more at the top, less at the top. Anyways, once I knew, I measured out that amount all along and drew a new sewing line. Then I trimmed all the extra material. So from that new sewing line that I drew, I gave myself seam allowance and trimmed it. was able to just take out that little bit of stitching that was left and have that side seam completely separate. I copied the same thing on the other side and took it apart so that my back piece was its own piece again, and I put that off to the side so we could focus on those front darts on the princess seam and at the shoulder seam. Then I took one of the front pieces and with chalk marked on either side, on the wrong side of the fabric, where the pins were. This meant that I could then take the pins out and see exactly where my dart was going to sit with the correct shaping. Then once the pins were out, I just connected those little marks and I knew there were my darts. I then did the exact same thing on the other front piece. My darts were in the relatively same area, which made the next step easier, but this is so that you know exactly how much you took in on each side. To make sure that the two front pieces were the same, even though I knew I was pretty close, all I did was lay them on top of each other, good side to good side. Then I used my pins and I figured out all my main dart points, which were the two side seams at the armhole, the bust point, because that was a straight dart, and then for the one that went down the body, I did the under bust area, the waist point, and the bottom, because those were kind of the main points and they were straight between those points. So I stuck the pins straight through on either side of all of those points, and then I flipped to the other side of the fabric to see what the other piece looked like, and for my luck, all of the pins were in the correct spot. Now, if your pin's sticking out where you thought the bust point was, and it was on the left side, let's say, but when you flip it around and you're looking at the right side, it's shifted, this is where you can make an adjustment between the two and get something that's an average between the two and looks right to you. I recommend using a different colored chalk so you know what your final dart chalk is. Now we're going to take our front facing pieces, making sure that they are good side to good side, and lay our other side front pieces on top of that. And we're just going to make that adjustment on the side seam that we did, copy that over, and now we know exactly where the darts will sit on every piece. So what you don't see me doing here, which you really should, is adding a little bit, about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch of seam allowance on the inside of these darts, and then cutting them up. Cutting out all that extra material on the inside. I like to do it by eye, but if you're a newer sewer and you don't have a lot of experience, I highly recommend just drawing that out with chalk and then cutting. I left all 4 pieces together because my fabric wasn't too thick, and I wanted to make sure that I ended up with 2 lefts and 2 rights, so that when I sew everything together, it's going to look correct and I don't end up with a bunch for one side and not the other. So then I took my first piece off and I folded the fabric onto itself, good side to good side. I started at the very bottom because I had a bit of fabric there as opposed to the armhole. Folded it together and sewed all the way up from the bottom to the waist, then to the underbust, into the bust, and then into the armhole, with that small seam allowance amount that we had just left ourselves. The real trick to darts is to clip everywhere that there's like a curve inside or outside. So I clipped it right at the waist, at the underbust, and along that bust curve. A clip is when you snip the seam allowance right to the sewing line, not through the sewing line, but right to the sewing line. This just allows it to lay flat and it doesn't bunch weirdly. After that, I just redid those 2 steps for all 4 pieces, making sure that the good side was folded to the good side. So when I laid them out at the end, I had 2 lefts and 2 rights. And we're going to need to add some interfacing on one left and one right side. just so we have a secure place to put the buttonholes and the buttons onto. So I just picked a piece of interfacing that was about 1.5 to 2 inches and ironed it onto that center front on the wrong side, making sure I had one left and one right. I did about 2 inches because I knew that my buttons would be less than 1 inch wide. The next step is to take one of those pieces we just put interfacing on and put the facing on top of it so that it's good side to good side, so you can see the seaming of the darts on the outside no matter which way you flip it. You want to make sure that only one side has the facing and the other side does not. The interfacing, that is. Then, using that seam allowance amount, we're going to sew all the way from the side seam along the bottom hem, giving a nice clear point at the bottom, all the way up the front, and then up that V into the shoulder. This means that those two pieces are all attached together. Then we're going to trim all of the extra seam allowance off that seam that we just sewed. Especially around any of the corners, you want to trim it in a V shape, very close but not over the stitching that we just did, so that when we flip this right side out later down the line, we get a nice crisp looking corner. And then, still with a good side, we're going to sew that seam allowance amount again around the armhole. So starting at the shoulder seam, all the way around, making sure that those darts line up between your two pieces into the side seam. And then we're going to do a couple of cuts into that seam called clipping the curve, where you cut in the seam allowance almost to, but not over, that line we just stitched. This lets it lay nice and properly. And then you can go in the side seam and flip the whole thing right side out and see how nice it looks. And then we're going to put our other two pieces together, which should be, again, the right side to right side. So one side has the interfacing, the other side does not. And we're going to sew all the way around the outside seam again, from the side seam down the bottom to the front, all the way up the front and up that V, up to the shoulder. We're going to clip those seams, and then we're going to do the same for the armhole. Start at the shoulder, go all the way down to the underarm, and clip that curve, and then flip it right side out, just like we did on the other side. We're going to fold open the back and have the good side facing up. We're going to take our back neck facing piece, that little piece that we traced from the back neck, and put it good side down on top of the neck seam. We're going to start at the middle point where that fold was and sew them together, that seam allowance amount, so for me it was about 1/2 inch, in from that back neck seam all the way to the shoulder, and we're going to go back to the center and do it up to the other side. Remember, these are good side to good side. And then we're going to clip this seam that we just sewed, making sure that we're snipping in along that seam allowance to the sewing line, but not through it. We have to do this along the curve or we won't be able to do the next steps. And the next step is to fold the whole thing open, so you're looking good side to good side. So the good side is facing up. Push all your seam allowance towards the facing and stitch that down on the facing. So this holds all of the seam allowance underneath towards the facing. It's a little bulky, so take your time when doing this. Then we're going to fold it so it's bad side to bad side. So we're putting all that seam allowance on the inside, and so that seam we just sewed is just on the inside. And we're going to stitch this down, the seam allowance amount, all the way around. And what this does is it gives us a nice finished edge on the outside, the good side, and has everything nice and contained on the inside, so we don't see any seams hanging around. And then the final thing we're going to do is trim any extra material. Now, my fabric, because it is a knit, does not fray whatsoever, so this made it nice and easy to have this be the finished seam. If you find your fabric is fraying, instead of stitching this straight down, you're going to want to fold that bit we're cutting off now under and stitch that fold all the way around so that's nice and finished on the inside. I would suggest pinning it at an iron because it is very tricky to do on the curve. And there we have the faced neck. So we're just going to repeat the step on the armholes, and we're going to do them both at the same time. So we're going to lay down our facing on the good side of the back, stitch it all the way around, and then we're going to lay it down on the other side and stitch that all the way around. After that, we're going to clip into that seam, but not through what we just stitched. Then we're going to open the seam, which means we're looking at the good side that we just sewed. We're going to push all the seam allowance towards the facing and stitch on the facing right beside that seam all the way down and around that curve. Then we're going to fold that bad side to bad side so that the good side is on both sides and it's nice and clean, and stitch that facing down again, the seam allowance amount, all the way around the armhole. At the very end, we're going to trim the extra fabric off, and this gives us a nice finished armhole on the back piece on both sides. And next up is the ties. We're going to fold them in half lengthwise, good side, stitch them all the way down, and turn them right side out. You can see my little piece of hardware here that I'm going to then sew in by hooking one piece through the middle bar and stitching it down. Now on the other tie, I actually sewed the end up and down so it was closed. You can do this by hand or by machine before you flip it right side around. And then all that was left was to attach them at the waist on the side seam of the back, making sure that they laid nice and flat. I like to do it with the good side up so I can make sure that that little hardware in the center is facing the correct way. Next up is going to be attaching the front to the back. We're going to start at the shoulder seams, and you can see that I'm folding in the raw edge of the front shoulder seam. We're going to tuck the back shoulder seam into that folded over section and then stitch along that fold to attach the front and back together. Now, the real trick with this is making sure that the front piece is laying the correct way so that your side seam on the front and back are pointed in the same direction. It's quite easy to get these a little mixed up. But just take a moment, take a deep breath, and make sure it's laying correctly. You can see that I'm putting pins in here as well to hold it in place, and making sure that that folded edge is nice and pretty. Then I'm just going to take it to the machine and top stitch across that folded edge and repeat on the other side. Before we attach the side seams together, we're actually going to hem the back of the vest. Now, I did this in reverse order, but it's a little easier this way. So looking at the wrong side of the vest, we're going to, at the side, fold up the hem twice. So we give ourselves a 1-inch seam allowance, so you fold it 1/2 of an inch towards the wrong side, and then an additional 1/2 of an inch. Then you're going to sew along that folded edge along the top. Now, because the back bottom is a W shape, we're going to do this in 4 parts, starting at one side, and then the other side, and then we're going to do the center V one side, then the next. To do the very center part of that, where it goes up, we're going to trim a little bit of the seam up 1 inch, just at that center point, so that you can fold it on both sides and sew all the way across. And the side seam is just a continuation of what we did for the shoulder. Lay everything flat so we know nothing's twisted, and we're looking at the good side of the front and the good side of the back. On the side seam of the front, because we have 2 pieces, we're going to fold them in on themselves about that 1/2 inch or whatever your seam allowance amount was. Then we're going to slide the side seam of the back into that we just folded over, again that 1/2 inch, and pin all the way down. This means that the side seam of the back is enveloped on both sides by the folded side seam of the front. We're going to pin it and then stitch all along that folded edge or just in from it so that there are absolutely no raw edges and everything looks nice and pretty. Repeat this on the other side, sew them both down, and your vest front and vest backs are connected together. And the very last step is buttons and buttonholes. Now when you're looking at the vest, as per the art, it's actually done in the more masculine way, where the left side, while you're wearing it, goes on top of the right side. So the left side while you're wearing it is the side that is going to have the buttonholes. Or if you're looking at it, laying it flat, it's the right side. So we're taking that side and we are measuring 1 inch up from the bottom and putting a little mark so I know where the bottom button is. And then we're measuring 1 inch down from that center front where the V ends to know where the top button is. Then I measure between those 2 points and then divide that measurement by 4 to find out where all 3 other buttons go. Next, we're going to measure in from that edge about half an inch, 1/4 inch to a half inch. I like it a little tighter, so I did the half inch. Then I measured the width of my button and added a 1/4 of an inch to that width measurement and marked that as well. So this gave me the actual width of the buttonhole, and then I also had the markings of the buttonhole, and I was able to mark out all 5 buttonholes at that point. Once I knew the placement, I was ready to sew it. Now a lot of machines have a buttonhole attachment or foot. I like to just use a zigzag stitch. I set my length to 0.35 or 0.4, so it's very close together, and my width to about 1. So it's a very small amount. I start at 1 point of my width. I go all the way down to my next mark of how wide I want it. Then I switch to the other side of my mark and go all the way down again. This gives me 2 vertical lines of stitching that are quite thin and right next to each other. Then at the 2 end points, I set my zigzag width to 2, so twice the amount we just had, or 3 if I had a little gap, and I re-sew the end points so that this ends up making a box all the way around. And I repeat this for all 5 buttonholes. So you don't actually need a fancy machine. You can just do this on almost any sewing machine. You want to be really careful when you're cutting open the buttonholes. I like to fold the fabric in half and then cut a little snip and then go in and open that up. If you're not confident making buttonholes, you don't do it a lot, what I recommend is putting a pin in perpendicular at that top line and bottom line so that your scissors can't snip too far. The more practice you have, the better you'll get, but really take your time with this one. And the very last step is putting on the buttons. I like to lay everything flat, and so I know exactly how much the one side with the buttonholes is going to overlap the other side. Then I pin through the buttonholes so I know exactly where those buttonholes line up to where I want the buttons. Now I always put my buttons all the way to the, if you're looking at it, left, because when you're wearing it and it's pulling, it's going to be pulling the button all the way to one side of the buttonhole. So if you put your button there to start, then you don't end up having weird gaps where you see the clothing underneath. So once I pin it, I take my piece of doubled thread, tie it off, and just go through, loop through the button. I used a shank button, which means it's like a flat button with a little loop on the bottom. And I just went through it about 5 or 6 times and then tied it off underneath. And I did this for all 5 buttons, and then it was done. So all in all, I'm 95% happy, which is pretty high up for me. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and if you had fun, feel free to subscribe, like the video. Thanks as always to my wonderful Patreons. You guys all make this happen. And hey, we'll see you in the next video.